Session 5 is on trade in the global economy. As you can see from this graph, the movement has been toward free trade over the past 50 years. This graph shows a bunch of different countries and the percentage of GDP that is represented by exports. So you can see that even though some countries have lagged a little bit, the trend over the last few years has definitely been an increase. This is actually just for emerging economies. So some of them are a little bit up and down. If you look at Russia, obviously right after the fall of communism, exports were a huge portion of the economy, and then it sort of went back down, and it hasn't really gone up again. But the others, if you look at China, and this represents the recession when Western countries were not able to afford as many Chinese goods. If you look at India here and Brazil, you can certainly see there's an upward trend. The United States clearly globalization has had a huge impact, and the trend has been toward more trade. This graph represents only up to like 2003, but you can see very clearly the split that we import quite a bit more than we export. And the data includes 2011. So you can see the trend toward a much greater reliance on imports for us, and then for other countries it's more on exports. In the summer we did lesson 25 on why people trade, and we talked about how voluntary trade benefits both parties. What we're going to talk about in session November 7th is why people oppose free trade. If trade is voluntary and if people are better able to satisfy their needs and wants by trading with producers in other countries, then why would people actually fight and oppose trade? So what we're going to do is we're going to do this activity from the globalization lessons, and I will give you the citation for that so that you can actually read through this lesson. You have it on Virtual Economics. So you can actually read through the entire scenario. This is a reader's theater, so a really fun activity to do with students. I've used it with a lot of econ classes, and what happens is the students each play a role. So some students are protesters, some are, maybe there's a narrator, there's ones that represent a Wall Street trader or somebody from Oxfam, so a bunch of different parts. And there's a lot of conversation, discussion, but the point is that each person offers their opinion on trade and globalization, and they offer evidence. And so with the students, I have them track who's for and who's against globalization and what evidence they offered. And then the next step of that activity, if you want to use it, is to actually have the students write an essay looking at the pros and cons of globalization. So what I would like you to do is, after you have read through the entire Reader's Theater, is make a list of the pros and cons of free trade, and give a few examples of evidence that are actually provided in the activity. Okay, then we're going to move on. That'll take us about half an hour to 40 minutes on the 7th. And then we're going to move on to this concept of absolute advantage and comparative advantage, which is the real economic theory behind trade. So first of all, absolute advantage, which really the concept was developed by Adam Smith, is the ability to produce more of a good or service than someone else in the same amount of time, or to produce the same amount using fewer resources. So absolute advantage is when you're actually better at producing something than someone else or than a different country. So if you look at these two production possibilities tables, the question over here is, who has an absolute advantage in soybean production? So what you need to look at is, if Mexico and the US both specialized only in soybean production, who can produce more? So if Mexico produced only soybeans, we can see they could produce 15 units. If the U.S. did, 30. So clearly, the U.S. would have the absolute advantage in soybean production. And then what about avocados? Well, Mexico could produce 60, the U.S. 90. So you don't want to be tricked by these highlighted parts, right? They're highlighted for different countries. But the absolute advantage goes to the United States for both. We could produce more of either soybeans or avocados. Okay, that's absolute advantage, and it doesn't tell us what we should do in a scenario of trade. What we want to know for trade is what's called a comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is different because it's the ability to produce something at a lower opportunity cost than a competitor or a different country. So if you look at these tables, same information, now what we need to do is we need to calculate opportunity cost. And we're not really used to doing that with we don't really know how to do opportunity cost overall for Mexico or the U.S. because we're used to calculating it as we move between points. So when we did this in the summer, we looked at what's the opportunity cost as you move from A to B or B to C. So what we need to do is we need to shrink these data tables down so that we're looking only at the two extreme cases. So you can see here, we can take the data from this table and put in only the two extreme cases for Mexico. If Mexico produces only avocados, they'd produce 60. Only soybeans, they'd produce 15. So you can see where that data goes into this grid. The U.S., if they specialized and only produced avocados, they'd produce 90. That came from this table. And if they produced only soybeans, it would be 30. So now we have a much simpler grid where each country only faces, we can calculate just one opportunity cost moving between the two. So if the U.S. were to specialize in avocados, to calculate opportunity cost, what we need to know is how many units of soybeans are given up, right? So if we give up 30 units of soybeans, we'd get 90 units of avocados, so our opportunity cost of avocados is 1/3. Conversely, if we specialized in soybeans, we'd give up 90 units of avocados to get 30 units of soybeans, so the opportunity cost would be 3. Okay, you might want to pause for a moment to practice so you can calculate the opportunity cost for Mexico. Okay, the answer is if Mexico specializes in avocados, their opportunity cost is 1/4 of a unit of soybeans, and if they specialize in soybeans, their opportunity cost is 4 units of avocados. So we have quite a bit of practice that we'll do actually in class on November 7th. This is one of the practice problems we'll do. So if you want to look at this one, again, so if Australia is producing sleds instead of clarinets, what did they give up? 2. What did they get? 300. So it's 2 divided by 300. Okay, and if they're producing clarinets, it's 300 divided by 2, so 150. So just practice that skill. You're going to have a few assignments that you can work on with this calculating the opportunity cost. Once you have calculated the opportunity cost, I'm going to go back to this one for a moment. We knew that for the U.S., this is 1/3 if they specialize in avocados, and for Mexico it is 1/4. So the secret to comparative advantages, once we've calculated these opportunity costs, is to look for the country with a lower opportunity cost. Mexico's opportunity cost in avocado production is only 1/4. That is lower, so they should specialize in avocado production. When it comes to soybeans, the U.S.'s opportunity cost is 3, Mexico's is 4, the U.S.'s is lower, so they should specialize in soybean production. So with comparative advantage, just to recap, you want to calculate opportunity cost for each country for each good, and then look for which country has a lower opportunity cost, and that is what they should specialize in. Once we've worked through these problems, we're going to put a little twist on it, because in addition to those problems we just did, which are called output problems, there are also input problems for comparative advantage. And when you're doing an input problem, the numbers in the grid no longer represent output possibilities, but they represent resources used to produce 1 unit of output. So it's a little bit more challenging to calculate the opportunity cost. We're not used to doing this. So this is, say, the number of units of labor required. So in Estonia, it takes 20 workers to produce a unit of stuff, but only 10 to produce a unit of nonsense. In Venia, it takes 40 workers to produce a unit of stuff, 50 to produce a unit of nonsense. So you can see that Estonia has an absolute advantage in both. They use fewer workers, okay, to find absolute advantage. To find comparative advantage, it's a little bit trickier. We can't just say, oh, Estonia, take, what we give up is 10 units of nonsense, and put it over what we get, because these numbers don't represent outputs. So you have to think about it a little bit differently. Ultimately, what you're doing is, instead of putting 10 over 20 for Estonia, for opportunity cost for stuff, you're putting 20 over 10. Okay, so you're really just flipping it when you do an input problem. But to make sense of why we do that, I want you to think about, if Estonia produces stuff, it takes them 20 workers. How many units of nonsense are they giving up? And the answer is they're giving up 2, because those 20 workers, right, they could have produced 2 units of nonsense. In Venia, if they produce stuff, it takes them 40 workers, right, and it would have taken them 50 to produce a unit of nonsense, so they won't even give up an entire unit of nonsense. They just give up 40 over 50, or 4/5 of a unit of nonsense. So how do we know that this works? David Ricardo is the one who came up with this theory, and he proposed that if nations specialize in producing goods and services for which they have a comparative advantage and trading for others, total production of goods and services worldwide will increase, and people in all involved nations will benefit. So the reasons for that: nations will produce what they can produce at the lowest cost, right? They will become better when they specialize. They'll get better at whatever it is they're producing. So Mexico will get better at growing avocados, and the U.S. will get better at soybeans. Resources will go to their greatest value, purpose internationally, and prices will be lower as we trade, and standards of living will improve. Okay, and most economists believe that this has been the result, although obviously in practice there are some drawbacks that the theory doesn't address. So this next activity on radios and rice, if you do this activity, if you complete this and look at what are the opportunity costs, right? What are the opportunity costs to Indonesia of producing radios or rice? What are the opportunity costs to Japan? The next step is to draw the production possibilities curves for both countries. And then what you want to do is take this one step further. And I'm going to ask you to email me the answer to this. Okay, but what I want you to do is draw the production possibilities curves and then assume that each country produces the good for which it has a comparative advantage and then trades for the other good. So figure out which country has each comparative advantage, assume they're going to produce that, and then see how much they could trade for. And I'm going to tell you that they can trade at a rate of, let's say, 2 radios for 1 unit of rice. Just use that as the terms of trade, 2 radios for 1 unit of rice. And you're going to draw another line that represents the consumption possibilities curve. All right, we're almost done with this section. One more thing, and that is this. This is actually an AP free response question, but it's a good practice question. So I'm going to ask that you answer this question and include your response to that in your email to me. That concludes this. I will do one more video that just looks overall at trade, the impact of trade and trade barriers.